Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, our dear students, our followers on the social media, may the blessings of God be upon you all. My name is Sayyid Ahmed Boujili. I'm a professor at the Critical Security Studies program at the Doha Institute. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you with a group of distinguished panelists for a new lecture by the Strategic Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Our theme today is the theme of the hour, the war on the Ukraine, or Russia's war on the Ukraine, to be more precise, which has entered its sixth month, and unfortunately there does not seem to be any indications militarily or diplomatically that an end is near or in sight. Our discussion today will deal with a number of issues, starting with the developments with the military operations in the last few months in general, with special focus on the latest military developments, whether at the level of the conventional warfare and unconventional warfare methods, and we will focus on an important, probably the most important point, and that is the foreign fighters. This issue, which has been linked to many international wars and conflicts and civil war, and since 9/11 has been linked to what's known as the global jihad and reached its peak with the rise of the Islamic State, ISIS. The context of foreign fighters in the Ukraine and Russia is different than that in the Middle East, but despite that, there are a number of similarities, especially when it comes to the questions like where have these fighters come from, what are their ideologies, their social backgrounds, how were they recruited, and what is their legal status, and probably and most importantly, so far as we're concerned, their effectiveness in combat and fighting, and what will be their fate after the war is over and their return to their home countries. These questions and others will be dealt with three distinguished specialist experts. They happen to be on the ground either in the Ukraine or on its borders, and they will convey to us some of the details of what has been happening and what is happening right now. Before I move to our first speaker, maybe it's worth mentioning that we have simultaneous interpretation available, and I remind our distinguished followers on the social media that they can pose their questions to our panelists through the Q&A feature. Our first panelist and speaker is my dear friend Dr. Omar Ashour, and please allow me to introduce him in few lines. Dr. Omar Ashour is Professor of Strategic and Security Studies and the founder of the MA program for Critical Security Studies, and he heads the Strategic Studies Unit at the Doha Institute and the Arab Center. He used to be a professor at Exeter University for 10 years and McGill University for 2 years. He was senior advisor to the United Nations in the field of combating terrorism and violent extremism, and he was the author of the first report on reforming the security sector in the Arab world and Middle East by the Ashour. He was a fellow researcher at the Brookings and at Chatham House in London in 2015 to 2017. He was also a visiting lecturer at Barcelona and Bogazici universities. Dr. Omar Ashour has many books and publications, including the radicalization of jihadist transformation of the armed Islamic movement, and also how does ISIS fight the military tactics in Iraq, Egypt, and Syria. He is the author of a book, Bullets to Ballots, Collective De-Radicalization of Armed Movements. Dr. Ashour will present on the Russian war on the Ukraine, the conventional and hybrid adaptation of this war. Dr. Omar, the floor is yours. You have 20 to 25 minutes. Thank you very much, my dear friend, Dr. Seed, and my thanks to the Arab Center and the unit also. And I would like to welcome our distinguished gathering and our followers on the social media and our dear colleagues Hamish and Casper. I haven't met them for a long time. The questions posed by Dr. Seed are good enough to have one or more than one conference to deal with them. I will not have time to allude to all of them. I'll just give some background about this theme and another research project I'm involved in. Very quickly, some quick themes. I'll talk about the background of this research project and the escalation in this war. This war has started 8 years ago, and what we have seen lately was an unexpected and very intense escalation. We can divide this conflict into 3 phases of development. And in this context, I will analyze the conventional and hybrid context of this war. What I'll start to do is, first of all, to deal with how to deal with the smaller side, the underdogs, who are not necessarily the weakest. How are they dealing with the situation, how they are fighting, and in the beginning, there were 5 cases of smaller countries and 5 armed organizations, which started in the Ukraine in 2016 because of the situation in the Ukraine. Was relatively easy in those days. The flights from London to Kiev were direct and easy. You did not need to go to a neighboring country and make a long road journey to Kiev. So that was unique. As a result of that research, it was meant to be a chapter in a book, but I found enough material, so it came out in the form of an entire book. The 2 researches, or the first or the second, can be put in the context of military adaptation and innovation, and I went down to the tactical and operational level rather than the strategic level, because there is enough good literature when it deals with this question at the strategic level. Part of the background too, and what I'm going to present now, is a working progress. It's the result of some 19 interviews, 3 field trips, and some primary sources and some research into the literature, and of course some open sources, and also with some reliance on open source intelligence. The outcomes, hopefully, you will see by a strategic paper published by the Arab Center and an article in English, and later on in the form of a book about the escalation of the war. If we look at the Ukrainian capabilities between 1991 and 2014, in 1991 there were some 800 personnel, at least on paper, and few thousand warheads, which were handed in 1994 in return for security guarantees from Russia, the US, and the UK to respect the sovereignty of the Ukraine. Later on in 2014, on paper, the Ukrainian armed forces in 2014 numbered around 130,000. But so far as readiness, combat readiness, we were talking about 3 brigades almost, 1 airborne, 25th, and 1 aerial attack, number 95, and they will be in the lead in the fighting, and also a mechanized infantry brigade, number 93. The readiness combat was at the level of brigades and battalions. Maybe it was not up to scratch. In February 2014, a colleague has a nice book, and he says that he talks about some details before the invasion in the Ukraine, and he says that the command of the Ukrainian fleet in the Crimea, when the scenario of a Russian invasion was floated, it was met with mocking and ridicule. So therefore what happened was a surprise. It was a complex hybrid operation. All the elements of hybrid warfare was there: propaganda, infiltration, intelligence work, coordination with front organizations, false front organizations, and also the militia aspect was there. Maybe you'd see in the picture to my right, that every Spetsnaz, regular Russian soldier, is accompanied by a militia member. People thought this was part of the Kadyrov militia from Chechnya, but they were Vostok Battalion, the Western Battalion, who was a competitor to Kadyrov, who was eliminated in Dubai. So the regular and the irregular aspects both were present. Some people called that the application of the doctrine of Gerasimov, and it's not a doctrine, and Gerasimov is not the founder of it. Mark Glotti said that I named it a doctrine while it's not a doctrine. For anybody who has some background information regarding the Soviet military, the Maskarov operations were known in the Soviet encyclopedia from 1940s. I call this Maskarov with muscles, because the infiltration and the covert operations happened, and with an aerial landing also, and forces on the ground in the Crimea had forces on the ground. Between 20 to 30,000 Russian troops were there following the Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol and other units. And you will see from the pictures behind me is how victory was secured by the Marine Brigade 801. When they entered the battlefield, the victory was already achieved. They went there to secure it, with after the elements of propaganda, infiltration, intelligence, civilian participation, all was done and achieved. The tanks entered the fray after the victory was secured and everything was done. There was in movement in Crimea and Kharkiv. Both provinces speak Russian, but in Kharkiv there were no 20 to 30,000 Russian troops. When we saw what happened in the Crimea, that decisive victory, what happened was Kharkiv was a resounding defeat, because there was some expectation, and this is a picture from February 2014. The same time what was happening in the Crimea, this was happening in Kharkiv. So people in Kharkiv maybe expected what will happen. People went out to the streets, and the announcement of Kharkiv Popular Republic on the 7th of April lasted one day. It was ended on the 8th of April. So in the Crimea, it was a big victory. In Kharkiv, it was a resounding defeat. If you had interviews with those who fought in Sinai in 67, and the feelings when like tight flint cling and the determination on the faces, you'll see and you looked at the images of those who came out of the Crimea, you'll see similar images. Also, so far as losses, 17% of the airborne equipment and also air defense, including S-300 batteries, and also half of the Marines' equipment was taken from them. The other movement was in the Donbass, and the Donbass did not fall then, and it hasn't fallen yet. This is contrary to what some Arab analysts say. Sometimes they announce the fall of the Donbass before the military commanders. Lugansk and Donetsk, Lugansk fell in July after 6 months of fighting, and it was the only province after the Crimea which falls completely. The others, Kherson and Zaporozhye and others, have not fallen entirely. The war in Donbass continues from April, from Sloviansk until the current day. There was some incursion westwards, some 30 miles from Dnipro. It was resisted, and then the Ukrainian forces started advancing to liberate a number of towns and villages in the direction of the east. In 2014, after what happened in Crimea, there was resistance on Plan B, and the Plan B meant simply to ignore the allies, the administrations, Obama and Merkel administrations. They gave an advice to the Ukrainians that do not resist. The Crimea will be restored with economic sanctions and diplomatic means, and if you fight you will be killed. So therefore there was some conventional military action. Some brigades were moved from the west of Dnipro, the river Dnipro, to the eastern bank, and also the operation, which was one of the most amazing operations conducted by the Ukrainian forces in July, August 2014, and Brigade number 95 by Mikhail Manzarovsky, who became a national hero, was commanding that brigade. The longest incursion I hear of, I never had anything like it. 470 kilometers, 170 kilometers within enemy lines to liberate the Ukrainian forces who were surrounded between the separatist forces and Russian forces. This line was penetrated, and the Ukrainian forces were liberated through a line in the north. Also, the president at the time, Alexander Turchinov, opened the door to those who wanted to volunteer to fight. He said in front of journalists that basically he gave the weapons to whoever wanted that. Before a decree was issued, he said if this happens again, he will go to prison. So this was done rather randomly and not through a central way of organizing. And after August 2014, the areas in white are the Donbas area. The yellow are the areas where no major engagements took place. The blue are the areas which the Ukrainians liberated. This is Sloviansk, Kramatorsk liberated, Mariupol liberated, Horlivka was taken, but there is a long story. The elected local council wanted to raise the Ukrainian flag, but he was taken from in front of the local administration building. On the 17th of April, he appeared as a corpse. Okay, Lugansk was liberated, and Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. What we see now, we see also the small village where in last July, there was a lot of fighting, but at that time there was no fighting. Donetsk fell after long fighting in Donetsk before the war. This is how it was. They hosted the European Cup in 2012. This was a research paper by Charles Butlers in 2016. He tried to explain what the Gerasimov doctrine was all about, and according to the keynote speech he gave in the conference by the Russian Ministry of Defense, he gave a very complicated explanation, but you see there is a curve for escalation which starts with the secret underground covert operations. So if then the muscles or the military power comes in when it's discovered, and those who perpetrated, then there will be deniability, and then when all of this happens, the target will be approached by force and taken by force. So this is the chart he gave it, and this is a translation of the article. The reason behind the fact that this is not a new doctrine, the reason is the size of changes which took place since the Serbian revolution against Milosevic, and going through the other colored revolution and the Arab Spring. And the Russian authorities do not see this as an attempt at democratization and revolutions by people. These are successes of the Western intelligence agencies. They consider them as hybrid operations from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, where the Western intelligence agencies managed to get rid of regimes which are either close to Russia or allied to Russia. And therefore, Russia in return should escalate the hybrid operations and get better at it. This was the perception in Russia. So therefore, this was in February 2013, and there was, before that, there were comments on that. So they considered what happened against Mubarak. This was an intelligence operation, and Russia can do the same. And if there was a need to resort to force, then so be it. Also, this is from the Operation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, when there were skirmishes at the level of an artillery battery or a battalion at ground level, which was taking place at the time of the ceasefire. If you look at the time, sometimes after the Minsk II ceasefire agreements, you will see the number of engagements were 40 a day sometimes. But when the Russian intervention in Syria in the fall of 2015 happened, the engagements fell to the level of 0 in the war between the Ukraine and Russia from 2014 to 2022. So this gives you an idea who was leading the fight, who was escalating, and who was de-escalating. I'm sorry I took too much time. About the phases of development, there are 4 main phases. On the 24th of February 2014, when about 120 tactical brigades, and after some reforms which took place after the Georgian war and the embarrassment for the Russian forces, they reorganized so that each brigade can be a tactical group which can fight independently with its artillery units, with its field hospital, and they can manage themselves for a long time independently. This was the new organization, but when they went to the field, there was no operational command as it's understood. So these units did not fight jointly. They tried to invade, or they have invaded from the north, Belarus, and from northeast. From the north, they targeted the eastern front, eastern units near the Russia and near the China and Japan borders. These units tried to invade from the north, and they reached Kiev, and it seems that there was an unconventional side. There's a big question mark, because the unconventional factor was maybe to assassinate the president. A unit belonging to the Rafgardian, the National Guard, which is a Chechen brigade, managed to reach where the president was, but the SBO, the Alpha group from the Ukrainian armed forces, resisted them. So there was, to a large extent, the conventional aspect was not that distinguishable, and it seems that all what they was planned was to repeat what happened in the Crimea by landing security units, police, etc. The victory was to be a conventional one, and then followed by heavier units to secure the outcome. It seems that this did not happen, and in a nutshell, Babushkaf in Gucha and other areas, in the north, they found themselves in a war with the people. It says everybody who had a mobile phone, everybody who was watching what was happening became an element of intelligence. Some reports in Gogverif, a grandmother saw a convoy moving towards Kiev because there is no call center to call. She knew a person in the Ukrainian forces, and she informed him, and she located the place, and the convoy was attacked. and where her house was very close, and her house was very close to the location of the convoy. She prayed to God that she will be safe, because when the convoy was to be attacked, that would endanger her own house. Some of the elements that we can allude to very quickly. At the beginning, it was a multi-domain maneuver warfare, which included land, sea, air, and space, and cyber intelligence. Of course, in addition to some foreign fighters and volunteers, some who played a role that we can come back to later on. Ultimately, in Kyiv, the Russian army was defeated. Whether it was a conventional or unconventional, this is something we can do. Zhytomyr, Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv, parts were liberated, parts were not. But by and large, the penetration and advancement in the east was deep. In the south was deeper, but with two spearheads. One towards Mariupol they reached, and one towards Odessa, but Odessa was stopped by Mykolaiv, and the situation is not. And maybe there is an attempt to liberate Kherson too, we'll see. The first final result was a failure in achieving the strategic aim for the Russians. This is the end of the first phase from February to March. In April, we entered the phase of a war, a trench warfare, more than a mobile warfare, and with a focus on the east and the south, and with some focus also on an attempt to start taking small pieces of land piece by piece, rather than just making one whole advance towards Kyiv. I know my time is almost over. If we look at the map quickly, the areas in blue were liberated. This is a map until the 5th of April. There were areas which were liberated afterwards. This is a comparison between what happened in 2014, Luhansk and Donetsk, and in the Donbass region, which were under the Russian-led separatist forces, and other provinces. This is the current situation. There is an advance. Lugansk has fallen completely. Donetsk, maybe half or less than half, still under Ukrainian control. Now we enter the third phase, the phase which it seems to me that the Donbass region is constant with slight changes, like an advance of 5 kilometers here, 10 kilometers there, then a resistance here, and the southern front is changing, and it seems that the Ukrainians are preparing for a counter-attack in the Kherson region, and also operations within the occupied areas are now seeing an increase. Zaporozhye and other areas, until they reach the Crimea region itself. So far as we can, maybe we can talk about the Western support in the Q&A section, and we can give some facts and figures, but I'll stop here because I know I took at least 8 minutes more than the time allocated to me, and I wanted to say something about it. But I'll leave the floor now to Casper, who will talk about the foreign fighters. Thank you very much, and sorry if I've taken too much of your time.
Thank you very much indeed for summarizing the issue at hand. He has talked about the root causes, the historical background, and the three phases. Indeed, I have sympathy with you because the time was not enough, and you have condensed what you wanted to say, and I think you do have more to say. Perhaps we will do that during the Q&A session. Now we'll move to our guest, the second panelist. He's Dr. Casper Edward Rekawe. And allow me to introduce the gentleman. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, Norway. He worked as a researcher at the Polish Institute of International Affairs and Globsage, Slovakia, as well as the Counter-Extremism Project in the USA. And he holds a fellowship at the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence in the University of St. Andrews from the UK since 2014. His research has been focusing on the issue of foreign fighters on the front lines of the Russo-Ukraine war. His book on the issue, entitled Foreign Fighters in Ukraine, the Brown-Red Cocktail, will be published this year by Routledge, and he's the author of Irish Republican Terrorism and Politics, a comparative study of the official and the provisional IRA. He'll be talking about the volunteers and the foreign fighters in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Mr. Casper, the floor is yours, and you have 20 to 25 minutes.
It's a pleasure and it's an honor. I'll try and talk you through an aspect of this war, which is, and I'll try to demonstrate it, both conventional and unconventional. And I'll tell you why I claim that, because we're in a very specific territory and this is a very specific conflict. And I think you might recognize some of its elements as familiar to the situation in the Middle East. But let me talk you through it. I have a short presentation. I'll be showing some slides, and I hope all will become clear in a few minutes. So here goes. Can you see my slides? If I can just, if someone can indicate if that all is okay. Yes, sure, super. So essentially, I'll focus on the foreign fighters. I've been looking at this subject since 2014. So not only the fighters who came in 2022, but also the fighters who have been coming into Ukraine and to Russia to fight in this war in 2014. Because as Omar was demonstrating, please remember, this isn't something that has been with us for 6 months. It's been more intensive in the last 6 months, but it has been with us for 8 years now, or 8.5 years really. And you have to remember that the fighters, the foreign fighters, the foreign volunteers, and I'll explain the difference in a minute, they were coming there since February 2014. So actually, some of them even came in January 2014, before turning into fighters. They came in as other people. They didn't know at the time they would turn into foreign fighters, but they eventually did. So we have an 8-year legacy of this, and I'll try to talk you through it and try to depict it all as concisely as I can. So essentially what you're looking at in this Russo-Ukrainian war, please don't call it war in Ukraine. It happens on the territory of Ukraine, but when you say war in Ukraine and it indicates as if it was some kind of a civil war, it's not. It's a state on state. It's an aggression by one state against the other. And if this wasn't clear to you in 2014, to many people it wasn't clear, since February 24th, 2022, it should be clear enough. So essentially, you are looking at a conflict waged by two sides, which have a very long track record of using unconventional means, irregular means in their warfare. So if you look at history, both of Russia and Ukraine, because of the logistics of warfare in this part of Europe, Central Eastern Europe, huge distances, flat land, not very, not very much populated, not too many towns, really bad roads, atrocious weather at times, you really have to make sure that when you fight the war, you have everything right, and at the same time, you're trying your best to get around those logistical obstacles that I've just outlined to you. There's a lot going on, and you cannot control all the factors in this war. Therefore, what you're trying to do is to essentially outsource it. You try to outsource it to some sort of irregular, unconventional forces that will do the fighting for you. You could almost say that to some extent, it's in the DNA of both sides fighting this war. If you go back to the Cossacks, the unruly, yet very good fighters, determined, at the same time irregular, using irregular warfare, using irregular units, using volunteer units, bottom-up formed, you'll get the picture. And there is a tradition of that in the region for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it involves both Ukraine and Russia, but at the same time, it involves other actors who are involved in that warfare, meaning Poland, or the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania, Turkey, Ottoman Turkey as well, and the Khanate of Crimea, so the Tatars. They all fight like that. They all try to use these means. And what you see today, to some extent, it's a continuation of that. And I know sometimes my Western colleagues are really perplexed. Oh, how is that possible? It should be the states that fight the war. The states should pay for the soldiers, pay for the units, prepare them and put them to the front. Yes, it's all true. But you are operating in an environment which is slightly different, in an environment that has a different track record. And it is an environment in which there are certain shortages and limitations, also of state power and state organization. And in which, if you want to fight, if you want to put out units which will be fighting for you, they might sometimes have to be formed in a volunteer, bottom-up fashion. And they might be involved in guerrilla warfare. So again, if you go back, the first time the term guerrilla warfare is used is early 19th century, with the Spanish guerrillas fighting the Napoleonic troops in Spain. Well, let's be honest, this type of guerrilla warfare in that part of Europe, and probably in the Middle East as well, it has been fought for hundreds of years before that. It's, as I said, in the bloodstream. And there is one very more important point here. If you use units like that, if you use forces like that, historically, it provides you with deniability. You can then turn around and say, oh, it's not me, it's not us. It's almost a classic tradition that the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania would use Cossacks to attack Ottoman Turkey and then say, well, we didn't attack you. And then the Ottoman Turkey would use the Khanate of Crimea Tatars to attack the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania and then turn around and say, well, it wasn't us. You have kind of pre-hybrid elements there. We will use the term hybrid war throughout this presentation. You might have heard it in relation to 2014 when Russia allegedly has not invaded Ukraine or made it look so, and a few people actually believe this. But essentially, 2014, you have Russia launching hybrid war, where it mixes conventional with the unconventional, with information operations, floods people with fake news, etc., 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 to stay short of warfare. But if you go kind of like, outright warfare. But if you ask Ukrainians on the ground, how hybrid was that? They wouldn't tell you. They would say, well, it was an outright Russian aggression, simply limited in geographical means, limited to parts of Luhansk and Donetsk provinces of Oblast. And that's what many people actually bought, that this is some kind of a civil war, some kind of separatism, some kind of a bottom-up process. Then Ukraine, being in 2014 pretty, in bad state, its army is in a very bad state, it needs to crowdsource its war. So not, outsource, but actually to crowdsource the war, meaning you build up units with volunteers, with locals, basically fundraising for these units and putting them in the field. And only later does the state takes control of that very, 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 very field. It's the famous volunteer battalions that I'll be talking about later. These two wars, the hybrid waged by Russia, where it pretends it has nothing to do with the so-called separatists, in eastern Ukraine, who are all Russian, or mostly Russian, by the way. They even come from Russia initially. Only later does Russia recognize the fact that, oops, you know, they are our guys, and they're supposed to be local. So there's a change of leadership. You remove the Russian ones and you bring in the locals, but only later. And then you have the Ukrainian war, the crowdsource war, the volunteers war. Both of these wars allow for the arrival and for the appearance of foreign fighters on both sides of this conflict. This is what opens the door to the arrival of that very type of fighters, the kind of war. It makes it, you know, the conventional war being just a bit unconventional, just a bit volunteer bottom up in this sense. And now let me talk you through both sides, both in 2014 and in 2022, to kind of show you the difference, how they utilize these very fighters. So Ukraine 2014, well, it establishes volunteer battalions. There is a bottom-up groundswell of movement of people, and Omar talked about that a bit, so I won't go into detail. There is a groundswell of movement of people who want to fight, who feel they have something to contribute, and the state is unable to accommodate them initially, so they put together volunteer battalions. These are, well, at least partly unruly formations. These are, you know, bottom-up built. So in these formations, technically, it's not a problem for a foreigner to come in and say, hey, can I join you? Especially for foreigners who are actually willing to offer something, who are willing to offer some skills. For example, hey, I'm coming in, I have experience from that and that military, I can teach you infantry tactics. Would you like that? And of course, these volunteer battalions usually would say yes to this. But we are in Central Eastern Europe. There is a bit of uneasiness as to, can we take those foreigners? Do we want them? Can we trust them? And not all of these battalions actually take such volunteers. Some do. And with some of them, they still serve. This is the kind of, you know, original route recruitment for foreign fighters in Ukraine, in Ukrainian ranks, in the Russo-Ukrainian war. This is how it started. This is how it was done. There weren't that many coming in for a very simple reason, ladies and gentlemen. You know, this was a war that was hybrid. Russia successfully pretended to many of us that it had nothing to do with it. And quite a few people, especially in the West, were convinced that this is some kind of a civil war. Now, would you like to be a volunteer in a civil war, which is basically messy? It's in a place which is cold. It is in a place in which you do not know the language, and you simply don't know what to make out of it. That's why there is a small recruitment of such fighters coming in. But because it is a small group, there is a distinct group of radicals who are coming in 2014. They are coming in, they're visible, they want to be visible. For them, this is the great opportunity to actually say, hey, I'm here, I'm fighting a war against barbaric Russia, etc., etc., etc. That spoils the image of foreign fighting in Ukraine in 2014. And that continues up until today, that many people associate any foreigner who fights, and unfairly, any foreigner who fights on the Ukrainian side in the Russo-Ukrainian war, they say, oh, he's a radical. Because they remember some of the days of 2014, when yes, some of them were actually radicals. And believe me, I have interviewed them. Now, it's going to get more messy and funny in relation to this when I show you the next slide, but bear with me. So essentially, you have a small group, radicals stand out. And mostly, because of their skill and their enthusiasm on the Ukrainian side, they are put to work. They fight. They actually do fight. You might be thinking, oh, you know, what's the great news here? But let me show you what happens with the next slide. Now, the Russians, again, hybridity allows for the deployment of foreign fighters. Now, Russia, essentially, pretending it has nothing to do with the conflict, it basically mobilizes what it calls foreign volunteers or foreign fighters in Russia proper through the draft commissions of the Russian army. Remember, draft still exists in Russia up until this day, and every male citizen over the age of 18, 19 is in the files of the military committees all around the country. You have files on everybody. These guys who have recently gone through military training or have been in the army or have deployed to different wars, they get phone calls. Would you like to volunteer for the war with Ukraine? Not in Ukraine, really. But you will go there and you'll pretend you're just basically bottom-up Russian volunteers, but we'll give you the kit, we'll even pay you some money, and off you go. Russia mobilizes tens of thousands of people along this line. So this is the Russian first move. And they mobilize them into popular militias by those separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, which say, okay, well, I mean, we have friends from Russia coming in, so effectively they are foreign fighters. They're from outside. They're not from Donetsk or from Luhansk. They are a special help which is coming to us from Russia. Now, this is the tricky one here, because quite a lot of these guys who come in from Russia, they are pretty radical. You know, it's the Russian neo-Nazi far-right milieu which mobilizes for this war in defense, as they say, of the Russian world, against Ukraine, against NATO, against Western imperialism, etc., etc., etc. That's how they call it. They do come in. At the same time, there is an offer beaming from Russia towards Western radical circles. And it's funny because if it is both far left and far right that they try to attract, saying, hey, you can come here and you're not going to fight Ukraine. We don't care about Ukraine. You will fight America. You will fight US. You will fight NATO, because this in reality is a war against that. And funnily enough, ladies and gentlemen, both far left and far right of Europe, they think, well, this is great. You know, it's now we can have a chance to strike at them. And there are groups of radicals coming in, and especially from places like France, Spain, Italy, you know, so the Southern European dimension is very much covered, but also from Germany and other countries as well. But there's a problem. The popular militias of those separatists, they don't know how to use them really. They really don't trust them. Russians don't trust them. As they come into the country, quite often they are arrested on the way. Imagine, you are basically invited to come and fight against Ukraine, and then on the way, the Russian security services arrest you. When you say, oh, I'm going to Donetsk to fight for you, then they get arrested. There is a bit of like, you know, someone didn't get the memo from, you know, up high, what we should be doing with these guys. And there is a lot of farce. There is a lot of frustration. Most of these guys, and quite often they are used for photo opportunities and for fundraising. You know, that's how I got into this business. I saw on Russia Today, I saw a report about French men being in Donetsk wanting to fight for Russia. I fell off my chair. I literally fell off my chair. And that was 8 years ago, and I stayed on the topic ever since. So imagine these guys are coming in and they are media stars. They are turned into puppets, and they are thrown in front of cameras to actually fundraise, to make sure more people come in, but not that many come in for the same reasons you've heard before. It's far, it's hard to get there, it's cold, we don't know what this is about, we don't know what it is, etc., etc., etc. So these are the differences between the sets of fighters back in 2014. Let's fast forward to 2022. Now, situation is completely different. Russia takes its gloves off, like in the most boisterous way. It's a conventional war. Yes, Omar talked you through the unconventional aspects as well, but, you know, if you launch missiles, paratroops, and roll, you know, tank columns into another country, that's pretty conventional to me. And it's done in front of the cameras of the whole, you know, TV stations of the whole world. So they're not hiding anything. Now, Ukraine, of course, responds also with a conventional war, but being a weaker side, it will be looking for other elements of irregularity. And again, it goes back to the crowdsourced war. It stands up the territorial defense units, and all of them, if you guys go onto their social media platforms, they immediately, just like that, start fundraising for themselves. For boots, helmets, protective gear, medical gear, etc., etc., etc. This is a crowdsourced war again. So the big question is, how do the foreign fighters or foreign volunteers, meaning people fighting for a country, not for an insurgency or for an irregular formation, how do they fare in these wars of 2022? For Russia, the conventional, and for Ukraine, conventional as well, but with a bit of an asterisk, you know, with an appendix, that there are elements which are slightly different. Let's have a look. Ukraine 2022. So 27th of February, President Zelensky comes out and says, any foreigner who wants to come and fight, you're welcome. You can fight first. Many people say that this was a public relations move, that this was ill thought, that this was ill prepared. But please do remember one thing. This is late February. People are actually having discussions how soon Kiev will fall. This is the desperation in which Ukraine was at the moment. So I cannot blame President Zelensky for actually making that statement, as he's counting on able-bodied people to come in and help him and others defend Ukraine. It's a simple move. What you get, and that's a comment from one of the recruiters that I interviewed, what you get eventually is basically concerned citizens of the world. So you have people from all walks of life, from any country, be it Latin America, be it, well, even Middle East, be it Europe, North America, they all come in, and then you talk to them, they mostly tell you, I'm here to basically do a good thing for humanity. Of course, there are other justifications, and there are other elements why they are there, and that's behind, so to speak, the main one. But initially, they are the concerned citizens of the world. And it is a crowdsourced element. You know, it's not only President Zelensky who calls on these volunteers to come, but there are others. There are units, you know, individual territorial defense units are saying, hey, you can come in and join us. Individual military units of the Ukrainian army can sign up volunteers from abroad. They are also saying, well, if you want to join us, fair enough. But you need to have some experience, or preferably you need to have some language skills. That will make you, make the work easy for you and for us when at the front. But especially if you have good skills, if you have certain military standards, we can have you, we can deploy you. And obviously that creates a situation in which there is a mass of volunteers coming in. Many of them have no military experience, but they are do-gooders. They really want to help. They shop around for units shop around for them, and you have a very loose organization. And, I've spoken to quite a few, and they told me things like, I've fought with 5 units already. I've signed 3 or 4 contracts with the Ukrainian military already. I've been, jumping here and there. It's not that I fight on just one side of, one part of the front. I've been here and there. I've been to the south. I've been to the east. I fought in Kiev, etc., etc. It's very loose. It's very flexible. It's extremely amorphous. It's hard to pin down. This is the kind of, irregular, unconventional element there. And it is an ongoing story. We're 6 months into the conflict. And I think as we learn more about these volunteers, fighters, there will be more and more stories. There will be more and more to unmask in terms of the reality. But last but not least, let's look at the Russians. This is the conventional war. They roll in. Technically, there should be no space for individuals like that. But, there's a bit of rivalry, I feel. Russia sees that Ukraine is actually having foreign fighters. It's inviting them, foreign volunteers. And Russia probably goes like, right, okay, they have them, so we will also have them. We cannot be any worse. And this is when you see those videos of fighters from Syria allegedly signing up to go to fight on the Russian side. This is when you see the videos of fighters from, Central African Republic, Zimbabwe, and places like that. All these places in the so-called global south, where Russia is popular, so that Russia can say, hey, actually, the world is not on your side, Ukraine, is also on our side. And we have to have a more balanced view. The big thing is obviously the logistics of it, because quite a few countries which are close to Russia, like the whole of Europe, essentially minus Serbia and Turkey, basically banned flights into Russia. So you really have to try hard to get there. Then when you get there as a fighter, you will find out that your credit card will not, or most probably will not be working. So you need to take a lot of cash with you. Of course, if you're determined, you will go around these obstacles. But that's just something to remember. Plus, at the end of the day, Russia is more concerned with mobilizing its own citizens for this conflict than actually having a few foreigners who, again, can we trust them? Who are they? Why are they coming? Maybe they're here to infiltrate. But the foreigners that Russia does like, 2 types, points C and D. Veterans, ladies and gentlemen. They're happy to take veterans of the conflict from 2014. So if you fought for those separatists in 2014 and stayed in Donetsk or Luhansk, or stayed in Russia, or worked in Russia, and you are from a friendly country such as Serbia, as they perceive it, they will take you. And they field these individuals. Not maybe in Russian ranks, but in separatist ranks. Because please remember, Russia maintains this facade that it is a war that's not only fought between Russia and Ukraine, but there is also the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And these foreigners are deployed in the ranks of these units. You have Serbs, Moldovans, Belarusians, French, Slovak, all veterans of 2014. Just to be sure, they are safe. They've been here. We know them. We can trust them. They're around anyway. So it's easy to, kind of like push them to the front line. And then the 4th group, and you read about it quite a lot, I'm sure, the so-called famous Wagner group, which is technically illegal in Russia because you cannot have private military companies in Russia, but you can always have an NGO, which is essentially a private military company. Now, they want to recruit people, and they mostly focus on the Russian front. But then again, Wagner and other PMCs had private military companies. They had foreigners in their ranks in 2014. They had them in Ukraine, they had them in Syria, they had them in Africa. And again, it's the same nationalities, Moldovan, Belarusian, Serbian. Why not deploy them again? Why not have them again? Why not reuse this? And then actually turn around and say, hey, it's not only foreigners who are on your side. We also have them. It's not only loosely organized units who are on your side and volunteer units. We also have them. So, you know, do remember this, that this is a bit of a competition here in this sense, you know, showing, oh, you have something, we have something. You have something, we have some, you know, it's kind of like an ongoing match in this sense. Now, as I said, obviously this is an ongoing story. It's a story that will be, you know, still troubling me research-wise for God knows how long. So I'm happy to probably, you know, come back at some point to the Arab Center to tell you more as it looks. But for now, I'll stop here. Happy to take your questions. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Casper, for your valuable presentation. In it, you alluded to the nature of the war currently in Ukraine, whether it is conventional or unconventional. You talked about the volunteers and foreign fighters and all the questions which I raised at the beginning of this symposium, and he will be giving more responses and replies in his forthcoming book. Casper alluded to many points. We may come back to them in the Q&A section, but before that, we still have our third panelist, and that is Dr. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. And Dr. de Bretton-Gordon is a visiting fellow at the Magdalene College, University of Cambridge, and he is a world-leading expert in chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, and a commissioned reserve officer in the Army Staff Corps as a senior advisor and a member of the UK Ministry of Defence. He is also currently advising the Ukraine government on CBRN defense. He served for 23 years in the British Army as in a number of positions, including commanding officer of the UK CBRN Regiment and NATO's Rapid Reaction CBRN Battalion. He has worked in Syria during the current conflict setting, including the white helmets and the health authorities in Idlib regarding the victims of chemical warfare. Dr. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon also contributes to a number of global news organizations, news channels, and provides expert commentary. His memoirs in English was published under Chemical Warrior, Syria, Salisbury, and Saving Lives at War. Today he'll be speaking about Russia's unconventional warfare in Syria and Ukraine. Dr. Hamish, the floor is yours.
To discuss this very important subject, and thanks to the Arab Center for setting this up. I hope I don't repeat anything that Omar said. Unfortunately, I didn't catch all of what he said. I think as the conventional war or the Russia's conventional war in Ukraine is beginning to stumble, mainly because Russia's 20th century equipment and doctrine and technology is now found wanting against the 21st century equipment and technology and intelligence that the West is enabling Ukraine to do. There is now a more of a focus, I expect, on what I call unconventional warfare. And to me, unconventional warfare is putting the civilian population at the center of this war. And for me in particular, a key element of unconventional warfare is the use of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons or devices. And I'll explain what I mean. I'll go through them. In 20 minutes, I can only really brush the surface, but hopefully it'll give you a view. And I am producing a paper at the moment that will give more detail. A rather strange thing, I make a rather strange comment here, that if you have no morals or scruples, you would use chemical weapons all the time. You have no regard for the Geneva Convention or the rules of war. And I say this because I think President Assad of Syria is still in power because he used chemical weapons. Many will remember the Obama red line on the use of chemical weapons, which disappeared on the 21st of August 2013, when Assad launched a massive nerve agent sarin attack in Ghouta in Damascus, killing over 1,500 civilians. And the international community didn't react. And I think in a way that emboldened Putin to do what he's doing at the moment. But I was in Aleppo in northern Syria in 2016, when the 4-year conventional siege of Aleppo was broken by 21 days of chlorine barrel bombs. These chlorine barrel bombs, very simple, toxic industrial chemical, were dropped out of helicopters, hit the ground, the gas went underground, and either killed civilians underground or forced them above ground, where they surrendered. The same tactic was used in a suburb of Damascus called Ghouta in 2017, and another suburb called Douma in 2018. Very, very successful. I was also the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor in the fight with Daesh in northern Iraq. And I was with them when Daesh fired chlorine mortars at us near Mahmour to the west of Mosul. And that was a very profound time. The Peshmerga are the bravest men and women fighters you'll ever meet in the world. It absolutely terrified them. I was also there when Daesh blew up the sulfur factory Al-Mishraq, south of Mosul, putting a 400,000 ton toxic cloud of sulfur dioxide into the air, which had a strategic impact because it very much slowed the Iraqi advance to Mosul and the fight with Daesh. So I have personal experience of these sort of things. And when it comes on to CBRN, I'll use that acronym, if I may. It also fits very much in the Russian playbook. We've heard a lot about false flags. These are where one side claims the other side is about to use some terrible weapon and then does so itself. And the playbook that I've seen in Syria over the last 10 years is also very much being replicated in Ukraine. But what I'd like to do is to look at these various elements of CBRN and how they can be used in unconventional warfare, and potentially how they're already being used in Ukraine. I'll leave nuclear to the last because that is really the thing that is on the tip of our tongues at the moment and causing us most angst, not only in Europe and the UK, but also has an impact around the world. So I'll come back to that. First of all, looking at the chemical side, what I've seen with Daesh in Iraq and Syria, and also in Syria, is the attacking of chemical factories to create an improvised chemical weapon, if you like. Again, this has been tremendously successful because most civilians do not have protective equipment, so that they don't have gas masks, whereas the military tend to. So it has much more of an impact on the civilians. And certainly the view in Syria is if you could get the civilian population to surrender, as it were, then the military quickly followed. And that seems to be what the Russians are doing in Ukraine as well. In Syria, we saw hospitals directly attacked. We saw schools directly attacked. I said at the beginning, if you had no regard for the Geneva Convention, you would do this sort of thing all the time. The Geneva Convention stipulates that opposing sides should give to the United Nations areas or direct positions of their hospitals, their schools, key national infrastructure like chemical factories, nuclear power stations, and key religious sites like mosques and churches and synagogues. And they are protected under the Geneva Convention on the Rules of War. We found in Syria, when we gave the UN the grid reference of our hospitals, that the next day they were bombed because those grid references were shared with the opposition. And I expect similar is happening in Ukraine at the moment. We've already seen in Ukraine a number of chemical factories, ammonia factories near Kyiv being attacked, creating a hazard. No military reason to attack these places except to create a hazard. I've mentioned Daesh attacking al-Mishraq in northern Iraq, again, creating a hazard. When it comes to chemical warfare agents themselves, I'm talking to you today from Salisbury in the UK. This was the scene of the Russian chemical attack to try and assassinate Sergei Skripal, a double agent with the nerve agent Novichok, what we call a fourth generation nerve agent, the most deadly chemical man has ever made. And it's clear that there is still an extant program. Of course, more recently, Alex Navalny, the opposition leader in Russia, was also poisoned with Novichok. So there is a concern that they have an extant chemical warfare program. However, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which has pretty much removed most chemical weapons from the world, should be able to deal with this if the Russians, who are signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention, do. Moving on to the biological side, I expect, like some other biological weapons expert, but I'd rather dismiss the biological threat, mainly because it's very difficult, although COVID has sort of changed all that. You know, COVID, which I'm no way at all suggesting is anything except a dreadful human disaster. Certainly no suggestion at all that it was deliberate, but a not very deadly pathogen has brought the world to its knees for the last 3 years, killed over 5 million people, and cost trillions and trillions of dollars. Unfortunately, I think that has woken bad actors up to the potential for biological weapons, because hitherto, good medical countermeasures were very good at dealing with most known biological pathogens, and most pathogens, the transmissibility is not great. However, we all know that COVID is very, very transmissible. There have been claims by the Russians that Ukraine forces have been poisoning Russian soldiers with botulinum, which was a biological warfare agent many, many years ago. I think it is highly unlikely. The most realistic explanation is that actually the botulinum has come from Russian rations stored in tins that are probably way, way out of date. And that's where the botulinum has grown. And if soldiers have contacted botulinum, it would have probably been through that. Again, there is a very good report in a French open source website called Open Facto about the development of potentially of Russian biological programs. But that has been the only indication in Ukraine. On the radiological side, I won't skim over it, but I'm not going to spend a long time on it. We are concerned that a lot of radiological isotopes have gone missing from Chernobyl, the power station in the east of the country, and we're not sure where they've gone. I mean, very sadly, a lot of the Russian soldiers who went into Chernobyl were obviously not very well trained or equipped, because we understand many of them have become very ill with radiation poisoning, because the Chernobyl area is still highly contaminated. Moving on to, I suppose, the main topic of conversation on the unconventional war at the moment in Ukraine is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in the south of the country. It is at a time, I think, the nuclear threat really has never been higher. If we look at the background, we have China, who is tripling its nuclear warheads. Iran now claiming to be nuclear capable, and North Korea trying very hard to get there. Unfortunately, nuclear proliferation, which the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, which has kept these things, under wraps really since during the Cold War and beyond. Again, there are a number of rogue states like North Korea and Iran that have not played due deference to it. And that is why we have expanded the nuclear capability. In fact, the UN President, Anton Guterres, only said last week, we are one misinterpretation or miscalculation away from a disaster. We already know that the Russians have threatened to use nuclear weapons. They've threatened the nuclear weapons strike on the UK. I personally think this is very much President Putin's brinkmanship. This is his ace card. As his conventional forces are failing, he is going to have to rely more and more on ace cards. And it is absolutely the case, I think, that it is keeping Western countries and NATO out of the direct conflict because of the nuclear issue. Now, the whole nuclear program is based on mutually assured destruction. The US and Russia knows that if they fired all their nuclear weapons, that is pretty much the end of the planet. And that has bizarrely, axiomatically kept the peace. But we have seen this nuclear muscle, as it were, flexed in Ukraine. Although when one looks a bit closer into it, when Russia says it's put its nuclear forces on high readiness, that sounds dramatic, but it's pretty meaningless. The UK's nuclear forces are always on high readiness. So that would be bizarre. The threat of using what we call tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine is very stark, and there's reports even yesterday, the potential of these devices being moved into the Crimea. I think the US and UK and Western intelligence and other intelligence services would pick up very quickly if tactical battlefield nuclear weapons were being moved into Ukraine. And although there are reports in the press, I've seen nothing more credible than that. And then we look at Zaporizhzhia itself, the largest nuclear power station in Europe, 6 reactors. And on Thursday of this week, last week rather, the power went out to Zaporizhzhia, which means that the safety devices, mainly the cooling systems for the reactors and the spent fuel, is being run on generators. Now, the Russians have controlled the plant for the last 6 months. We don't know the state of the plant. We don't know what maintenance has been going on. And the workers there claim they've been tortured and under duress. So that is a huge concern. Once your primary source of safety goes down, it's also almost like flying an aeroplane with 2 engines and one engine goes out. You have really got not much more to back it up. And both President Zelensky and, I said, President Anton Guterres of the UN have claimed we were very close to disaster. Now, it's very good news. We heard overnight that the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors will be going to Zaporizhzhia soon to check it out. Let's hope that's the case, because General Vasilyev, who seems to be commanding the Russian troops there, who in effect does the job for the Russians that I used to do for the British Army as the head of CBRN, although I expect his talents are more in the offensive than the defensive measures. Some of his troops have claimed that they have actually put explosives in Zaporizhzhia. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know, and I think it's probably unlikely. Again, I think it's brinkmanship. But the last thing that the West or anybody needs is for this power station to go up. And of course, in Doha, you will be very familiar with Bashir power station just across the Gulf from you. And one can imagine what would happen if there was an accident there. At the moment, we know that if Zaporizhzhia, there was an accident or it was deliberately set on fire, the contamination would all come west. The latest weather from the Ukraine Meteorological Office says that. Now, that could well change. And I expect if it changed to go east, then things would calm down a little bit more. So just coming towards the end of my 20 minutes, for me, unconventional warfare, and there are other elements to it which both the other speakers have spoken about, but my area is very much on countering, preventing CBRN use. And I think when people get desperate, that is when they turn to these sort of methods, and you can see how effective they can be. I think there is a balance between giving people reassurance and scaremongering, because as you'll all know, the threat that really undoes you is the threat you're not expecting or haven't been prepared for. So certainly in Syria and certainly in Ukraine, we've done an awful lot of work to prepare the population so that they will not become casualties. And I think by being very strong in our counter CBRN defense, it very much makes it less likely that these things will be used. But we do pay, I think, for the fact that the Obama red line in the use of chemical weapons in Syria dissipated. And we must make absolutely sure that around the world, bad actors and rogue states know that the international community will react if these weapons are used. And it's absolutely crucial that Putin understands that, because the last thing the world needs now is a nuclear confrontation. And of course, what we must do is to try and, win the peace in Ukraine as quickly as possible so that we can get that place back on track. It's a very quick run through of the sort of unconventional warfare from my lens, as it were. I'm very happy to share my paper in due course once the detail's done. That's me, over.
Thank you very much, sir, for this presentation. It was indeed invaluable, and hopefully we shall read your paper and understand the nitty-gritty of its content. We shall open the floor to receive your questions. Please, the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, my name is Salma Al-Jamal. A question to Dr. Omar. As far as the war is concerned, and you've categorized it into three phases, and you said that it has delved into the third phase. Do you think that it will continue to be unconventional? As far as Mr. Casper is concerned, to what extent the Russians and the Ukrainians have benefited from the foreign fighters? Thank you, Dr. Said. Thank you, Dr. Omar. I have two questions. The first one relates to the paper presented by Mr. Omar and the difference between the northern front and the eastern and the southern ones, tactically speaking. What was the difference and why the Russians succeeded in the east and in the south, and why they have failed in the north? So tell us about the difference, please. The second question is addressed to Mr. Dr. Casper. I would like to ask you about the effectiveness of the foreign fighters. How do they use what they have? So I want to hear from him how these foreign fighters were used. Tell us about the efficiency of the fighting skills. Thank you, Ala. Right, we'll start perhaps to answer these questions. Dr. Omar. Thank you, Dr. Sid. I'd like to thank the panelists for the wonderful interventions. I have my own questions, to be honest with you.
I'll ask the panelists in English, but I'll be answering in Arabic. Have we overcome the technical hiccup? He's asking. Yes, the answer. As far as Selma is concerned, the conventional and the unconventional elements are there. We see artillery use in the Donbass in particular. The Ukrainians are talking about 5,000 shells on a daily basis of the 155 millimeters, and the Russians are talking about thousands and thousands of shells, 50,000 shells on the part of the Russians. So every shell or every 10 shells from the part of the Russians, one shell is launched by the Ukrainians. So the percentage is 1 to 10. The other issue is to do with the MDOs in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and in Torchevska. We have witnessed the most prominent hybridization, if I might say, between the conventional and the unconventional warfare elements, especially in Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. In Lysychansk, and there was a breakthrough from the southern parts in the Wagner group. Played a role in this regard, as well as the special forces. And Mr. Casper has talked about the Wagner group, and they are of different level. They have started with a small kind of battalion, and it is a company between two brackets. It is not similar to the Black Water. The Black Water is listed, and it can be persecuted legally. They have dissolved themselves and they call themselves with a different name, but the Wagner is not listed anywhere. It is not present on paper. And it has become indeed a division rather than a battalion. And as Casper said, it plays a major role internationally. And it plays a role in luring the volunteers, and it goes to prisons, for example, and it provides amnesty to the prisoners, and it provides $3,000 or $3,000 to $4,000 to every single volunteer, and they are recruited as such. So they bring along an amnesty from the Russian state, and they transform the prisoners to becoming volunteers, and they provide them with $3,000 to $4,000. As far as Kherson is concerned, I think the war is fierce in Melitopol as well, and there are unconventional elements that are used. It is also unconventional and conventional at the same time, because the war is going on under the command of the special Ukrainian forces. So it is hybrid, yes. There is a mix. And we are entering the third phase, and we shall see different phases as well, because the operation is still going on. Microphone, please. Are we talking here about a counter-attack, or is it to do with an unconventional warfare? It is also a mix. There is a campaign, a Ukrainian campaign of counter-attacks, and the aim is to target depots and also the logistic centers and so on and so forth. It is to do with the Crimea. The Crimea has the logistic centers, also the headquarters of the Black Sea Navy. I think it has been bombarded twice by the Ukrainians, and the expectation is to do with an advancement in the Kherson by the Ukrainians, and perhaps to use the MLRS as well in that region. And in the Congress, there was a debate about providing the MLRS of the range of 300 kilometers, and it can be used from Mykolaiv. But on the Ukrainian side, they prefer the HIMARS because the S-400 might intercept the MLRS. So here, indeed, we're talking about a mix between the unconventional and conventional elements. There was another question. I'm very proud for our students to pose such questions. This is a difficult question. It might necessitate further lectures. However, when it comes to this very issue, I would like to say that in the north, Ukrainian laypersons, the Ukrainian people defended Kiev and the north. However, in the east and the south, it was a bit different. Some colleagues asked about this issue in February, and the only thing that I expected is the fierce Ukrainian resistance. Indeed, and I was right. The Ukrainians were prepared. The reserve list and the territorial defense forces. I spoke to a friend, and he said that a platoon of 27 persons has 21 javelins. So 27 persons can indeed stop a Russian battalion. And this wasn't there in 2014. And this is pertinent to what Mr. Casper has said, has talked about the training since 2015 up to February 2021. Most of the brigades or pertinent to land forces took training courses with American or English instructors or Canadian instructors, most of them, all of them. And it was kind of on a rotation basis. So they went through vigorous training, and they have prepared themselves indeed. And most people did not expect such resistance, but it was there. I didn't expect that Mr. Putin would inch closer to Kiev or launch an offensive against Kiev. I thought he would start in the Donbass, but this didn't take place, and unlike my expectation. David Darashvili in Georgia in November 2021 expected indeed this move. Everybody says that he will escalate in the east. Only David said he will indeed launch an offensive towards Kiev. The Kiev authority, the Ukrainian authority, did not expect that as well, for one reason, because they thought that 604,000 square kilometers and the troops that were amassed and the equipment thereby were not up to the standards, and they didn't expect that the Ukrainian state is the target rather than the eastern parts only. There's also another point or another question mark in the south. Reaching Kherson could have been very difficult because the bridges were mined, there were plenty of mines implanted on the bridges, but they were not detonated. They were not detonated. There's also the issue of skills in the south. Some battalions were very fierce in fighting on the part of the Russians. Some armies were very fierce indeed. So certain units played a major role in this regard, and we can delve into this matter further if you want later. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Omar. I'll pass the floor to Dr. Casper.
Thank you for the questions. They're similar, but there's also one more question in the Q&A section. So I'll answer them both. So the two questions that I got here, and then there's a third question in the Q&A. So I'll tackle them all. So let's start with what's the benefit from foreign fighters? Very good point. I think many Ukrainians and Russians would probably roll their eyes and say, not that much. Really, we prefer, especially in the Ukrainian side, the answer would probably be, in all honesty, more weapons systems, more equipment, more support. Yes, the fighters are valued and everything as a morale booster, as essentially tactical advantage for certain units, because they have made a difference, tactically. Yes, they have. They helped out in certain engagements and in certain combat situations. But I think the presidential advisor of President Zelensky said 1,000 people from abroad really fight. 1,000, there's supposed to be 20, 40. And the advisor said it's 1,000. So you can imagine that if Ukraine mobilizes tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, then at the end of the day, they will not be the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you like, in this sense. So that is that would be an over exaggeration. But if you have veterans from the Marines, Rangers of the US, you have the Marines from the UK, former special forces operators from all sorts of different countries, trained to NATO standards, who know what interoperability is, how to work with each other, and to what extent they will help the Ukrainian units. They will teach them how to operate these systems. But the thing is that in this war and in this theater, they must be given a chance. And because it's war and it's chaos, they sometimes are not given this chance. And there's been some complaints and moaning from those foreigners who are saying, "Oh, look, I'm a highly skilled special forces operator, and here I am to dig trenches and things like that." And the Ukrainians go like, "Well, tough luck." So there is a bit of that. Please remember about this. So that is the situation in terms of the effectiveness and the benefits. Do not think about them as international brigades in Spain. It's not the same size. It's not the same scale. It's not the same mobilization. But yes, they will help, tactically. On the other side, it's a mercenary business. Let's be honest. If there are foreigners there, and there are quite a few, they are in those private military companies. They're paid to do the job, and they are the cannon fodder because Russia has its own limitations of manpower. And there are the veterans fighting in the units of the Donetsk People's Republic, especially, and Luhansk People's Republic, as they call it, because they're experienced, and then both of these republics have basically vacuum cleaned the streets of their cities and towns for men, because they just needed the recruits. So anybody goes. If there's a foreigner who lives there, because some of them settled and stayed there, married locally to Donetsk or Luhansk women, they will be, of course, called upon. And, yes, they're good fighters probably after all those years. Yes, they are morale boosters. But again, their number is, it's not great, so they're not going to make some kind of an operational difference. Again, tactically, they might be of use. And some of them, again, are put in propaganda roles, where they've been doing that since 2014. They're doing that again. And then there's a question in the Q&A section, if I may, on the what can Russia do with those fighters post-war? Because it's been moving these fighters between Syria and Ukraine. And I'll give you 3 examples here. And that will show you what Russia is doing. So there's been a group of French who fought on the side of the so-called separatists in 2014. And 5 years later, there are huge riots in Paris, massive riots in Paris, done by the so-called yellow vests. So people who are protesting against some of the reforms of President Macron. And guess who forms the protective, cordon, who is the security of these protests? It's the guys who fought in Ukraine. Not all of them, but you have guys like that amongst them. Now, do not tell me that Russia wasn't happy with actually having guys who fought for it in 2014 and then they were causing trouble in the streets of Paris just to upset France. When you can do that and you're Russia, you will do that. Secondly, if you watch Italian TV nowadays, Italian TV is full of people who actually fought in Donetsk, especially two, who fought in Donetsk in 2014 on the side of separatists, and they are now the experts on the Russo-Ukrainian war. Of course, you can imagine on which side they stand, but they are used in information operations. They are out there to propagandize a certain viewpoint to a public which basically doesn't care, doesn't know, and is kind of, some kind of it's mystery to them as to what is happening in eastern and southern Ukraine. And they will be believed because they've been on the ground and they've seen it. So that's another example. And of course, they express a pro-Russian view. Lastly, some of the Serbian fighters who fought in 2014 on the side of separatists, they were basically staging a coup d'etat in a small country in Europe of Montenegro in 2016. It was a very unsuccessful coup, but nonetheless, again, they were staging a coup d'etat. Imagine that. They fought somewhere else, and then they were brought to another country, to create a conflict situation, not to an ongoing conflict, but to create a conflict. So you had the propaganda role, you had the rioting and political instability, and you have essentially an attempt to stage a coup. So hopefully that answers the question as to how Russia can use it in any way it wants, anywhere it likes. And there are billboards now in Russia which says Russia has no borders. It borders with anyone it wants. Therefore, we can come and upset you wherever we want to. This is what we're dealing with. Please realize this. This is what you're dealing with as well. So maybe these gentlemen will end up somewhere near you, not just near me or Hamish in the UK, but somewhere near you. That is the rather unfortunate situation.
Thank you very much indeed for this answer. Another question to Dr. Omar. Would it be possible to consider the Ukraine the underdog in its war against Russia, even if the NATO supports it? And there's another question addressed to Dr. Hamish. What are the objectives Russia is seeking as far as the use of CBRN or WMDs in the Ukraine? And there's also a set of questions to Dr. Casper. What is the fundamental difference between the foreign fighters? I'll paraphrase. Who do you think funds the foreign fighters in Russia? Is it the army, or is it to do with the oligarchs? And are there any arrangements to control the natural resources in the Ukraine and funding the foreign fighters? So a question about funding, basically. Dr. Omar, please. Oh, Dr. Hamish first. Yes, please. Go ahead, Dr. Hamish.
Hi. Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think I mentioned that, Putin doesn't have many aces, but I think the WMD is certainly an ace because he's pretty certain that the international community, would certainly not first strike or anything like that. But I think there are two reasons that the Russians are threatening WMD in Ukraine. First and most foremost is to keep NATO and Western forces out of Ukraine directly. He will be aware that NATO conventional forces, now far outmatch the Russians. We've heard talk of HIMARS, MRLS, and other sophisticated Western weaponry, which is far superior and in far greater numbers than anything Russia has. And we're already well aware that a lot of Russian precision weaponry, they're running out of it. So he has, it's, as I said, it's his ace to keep NATO out and to, be able to negotiate when he sees fit. I think the other element with WMD or CBRN, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, is terrifying the civilian population. It absolutely terrified the population in Syria and worked very well. We're in a slightly different position, though, in Ukraine. The Ukraine people, their military and their civilians have fought with a great bravery and great resilience because it is their home nation has been invaded. They are fighting for their lives. Of course, in Syria, it's all, it's their own government who is attacking the civilians. And really, they had no great support elsewhere, whereas the Ukraine people know that the majority of the world is supporting them and are behind them. So the WMD issue, I really think, comes from the unconventional warfare when the conventional fails and is not doing what you thought. And, we could go round back to the beginning. I think most commentators and experts believed that Putin was going to roll up Kyiv in a couple of weeks, and this, his invasion would last a very short time. And never in their military planning did they expect to be still involved 6 months later. But we know that their military planning, logistics planning in the beginning was woeful, it was dreadful. So I think we've come a long way since the early days, and the fact that it would appear Ukraine are now getting on the front foot. The offensive down south seems to be gathering momentum. We've seen the Crimea being hit, almost at will. I can imagine Putin is having some really difficult thoughts at the moment. And at the moment, his WMD ace is really his main card. So I think that's why the CBRN WMD thing has come up. And we've obviously got to play it very, very carefully to make sure that there isn't an accident or miscalculation. I cannot envisage even Putin deliberately using particularly nuclear weapons. I wouldn't put it past them using some of the others, but that's why they're being used. And despite the fact they've kept the peace for the last 60 or 70 years, we need to make sure they keep the peace way beyond the Ukraine conflict. Over.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور هامش. أمر مباشرة مع الدكتور كاسبر، لو يتفضل بسرعة، لو تفضلت، ثم نعود إليك دكتور عمر لاحقا.
All right, thanks. Right, so really quickly, the funding question. Please do understand that when you ask a question about, and it is a very good point, and it's a very good question. Funding, where does the funding come from for the Russian side? Even if these are different entities that are paying into the funds for different units and effort, at the end of the day, it's still very much the Russian state. It's not as dictatorial as North Korea, I'm not saying that, but the whole idea behind Putin's rise to power 20 plus years ago, and it's been a process, it didn't happen overnight, was to actually grab all the alternative centers of power, especially the oligarchs, by the throat. And you keep them mostly in place. You allow them to do things here and there, but at the end of the day, each one of them has a curator, someone who looks after them, from the presidential administration, from the security services, from military and stuff like that. So it might be different people sending funds via transfers, but at the end of the day, it comes down to one fund, if you like. Now, there is a lot happening between them because they compete for attention at the top. They sometimes backstab each other. They, shove each other in the back, in the side. And that's why we sometimes get the impression that it's different people or for different units, and that it's conflicting agendas. I'll give you an example. There is a political party which looks after the Russian Imperial Legion, which puts fighters onto the front lines for the Russian war effort against Ukraine. Now, you can believe that this political party is independent of the Kremlin and the Russian presidential administration, or you might not believe it, and you will be right, that it is essentially told to do so and pretend it has nothing to do with the Kremlin. This is a classic smoke and mirrors type of unconventional operation, which at the end of the day has many elements of conventionality. Now, there was a question on the Ukrainian side about the resources and things like that. Natural resources, as far as, for example, Donbass is concerned, they were mostly providing a loss for the Ukrainian state from the 1990s onwards. So yes, it was a lucrative takeover for the Russians in 2014 to some extent, but at the same time, those pesky small little republics, they were receiving something up to like €1 billion per month to be actually kept afloat from 2014 onwards, because they were, run by local thugs, local bandits, who were stealing their, the property of Donetsk and Luhansk to line their own pockets. So, that is something that needs to be borne in mind. And in terms of like natural resources, Ukraine's natural resource, great natural resources, is wheat. Is the fact that they're producing food for, half of the globe. Now, obviously, the fact that Russian forces are deliberately burning crops and, lobbing shells into fields to actually start a fire, that tells you quite a lot. You can now buy agricultural products in different parts of the globe, maybe in your country as well, from Russia, and Russians will say, oh, don't ask questions where we got it from, be happy that it's here on your table. So that is probably the resource that the fight goes on. But, there is a limited takeover of these resources by Russia, but obviously a not so limited blockade of Odessa and other ports. So for this, to this extent, that is an issue and that is a problem. But, we're not talking about resources that are funding foreign fighters. It's the state that funds them. That's one thing. And the second thing is that it's a crowdsourced campaign, like I told in my presentation. All these units are fundraising, and all the units that have foreigners are also fundraising. To give you an example, there is a Belarusian regiment fighting on the Ukrainian side, and it fundraised $300,000. Now, it's a big regiment, so that's actually not such a great sum, but I dare you, or you can dare me, to start a fundraising campaign that will get you $300,000. It's not that easy. So now look into basically any territorial defense battalion, into any unit, subunit, team, platoon, etc., etc. They're all doing that. They're all doing that, and this is where the additional money is coming. Do not think of it that Ukraine is sitting on, oil mining deposits and things like that, and with that, these are being funded. Yes, probably these units are also funded with private money, which is probably paid by Ukrainian oligarchs as well. But this is a situation that was happening in 2014, so that's nothing new. Like I said, it's a bottom-up process into which almost anybody chips in, starting with kids who are fundraising in the streets of Ukrainian towns and cities, and ending up with the oligarchs, and at the very end of the day, of course, the government and foreigners. Foreigners all around, especially in the West, probably to a lesser extent in the Middle East, but it happens. Thank you.
Now, Dr. Omar, I think the Ukrainians need even more, even with the Western support. This is on the one hand. Also, the way the Russians are fighting, if you remember what Stalin said, quantity has its own quality. For example, if we look at his battle in Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, in May, as far as I can remember, when two brigades tried to cross the river in Donetsk, one brigade was almost totally annihilated, maybe 1,000 to 1,500. But because, in the end, because of unlimited resources, the Russians took Donetsk. The loss exchange ratio in the Russian case is not in Russia's favor. In the small Chechen war, for every Chechenian killed, 5 Russians were killed. In the second Russian war, it was 1 to 3. Georgia was 1 to 1.2. So therefore, if you want to compare in Afghanistan, and the withdrawal in Afghanistan was 1 to 14 amongst, for 1 killed from the western side, 14 Afghanis were killed. And also in Russia and the Soviet Union formerly, they have their own way of thinking when it comes to war, because ultimately there is no democratic regime which will hold anybody accountable. After the first Chechnya war, they did not move. After Grozny war in August 69, from 3,000 fighters took 10,000 prisoners of war. Before I conclude, I have 2 quick questions.
So I'm going to switch to English. I just have 2 quick questions, one to Hamish and one to Casper. Hamish, what is General Vasiliev doing there? You know, they have if I understand correctly, it's a battalion-sized formation, and 500 men. So what is a Russian general doing in Zaporizhia with 500 men only? So that's one. To Casper, I heard the question on the combat effectiveness, and I'll have to switch to your friends in Azov, friends as jokingly. So now I'm comparing your previous research to your current research. So the previous research on Ireland, you had the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they were about to get destroyed because of the issue on home rule and the decision to basically destroy them by the British government, causing too much trouble in Ireland. And then World War I broke out. They fought like lions, and casualty rates like 1 in every 2. And when they came back, the British government decided that that's it, no one touches them, we keep the 6 counties, Northern Ireland. So combat effectiveness turned into, so will we see something similar with the other battalions? Because it's they fought like lions, Mariupol and elsewhere. And I don't know when will this war end, but some forecasts. Thank you.
Dr. Hamish? Can you hear me? Dr. Hamish?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
I missed the very first part of your question. I think it was to do with General Vasiliev commanding Zaporizhia. I assume the question was, is that a bit strange to have a 2-star general commanding 500 troops? Yeah, certainly it is very strange. Certainly, a NATO 2-star general would expect to command 5,000 to 10,000 troops. But he is a very key person within in the Russian military, and it's also reported he's also a GRU officer. He is very expert in CBRN, and again, I think the Russians see Zaporizhia as a strategic, I dare say, I don't like to say weapon, but an improvised device. And it is a key thing for them at the moment. Strategically, just north of Crimea, it's in a key position. The Ukrainian forces need to bypass or certainly go near it. Going back to my experience with al-Mishraq in Iraq, any accident there would likely cut off the advance of Ukrainian forces. So I think the fact that you've got a 2-star general commanding a very small garrison proportionately in Zaporizhia just underwrites how critically important it is to the Russian battle in Ukraine, and the concern with the counter stroke, whatever we want to call it, in the south, which could unhinge the Russian forces completely. There's already talk this morning about a lot of Russian forces being cut off in that area, and how that will unfold. So yeah, he's a key man, but commanding such a small force is slightly counterintuitive. Was that an answer to your question? Sorry, I did miss the beginning of it.
It's just a question mark, like, well, what is he doing there? So if you have any insights, but thank you.
Okay, so I guess my turn. Thank you for the question, Omar, and thanks for this. Well, some of these volunteers, let's be honest, they would love to have an impact politically after the war, whenever it ends, and they are hoping that this will give them a chance to grow politically. And there's all sorts of, from all sorts of quarters. Because if you get through this, if you survive, you will be, well, a hero. And some already used that popularity after 2014. I think 6 or 7 volunteer battalion commanders were actually elected to the Ukrainian parliament, but 6 or 7 out of hundreds. They dreamt about, the government of the soldiers, soldiers running the country, things like that. It never happened. And to be fair with you, the control that the Ukrainian armed forces, HQ, special forces, especially military intelligence and the civilian counterintelligence has over these battalions and over these new TDF forces and new formations probably pushes me to answer that no, it will not form into some kind of, all-volunteer core party that will take power in Ukraine, either in this or that way. It's simply, it might look like that. From the outside, but believe me, if 2014 was a test dry run for that, then I don't think we have, much to worry about. There are other issues, there are other worries. And yes, these organizations will push for some kind of, funding for veterans, some benefits and stuff like that. But taking political power, very unlikely, given how harnessed they are by the war effort and to the war effort. It will be hard for them to actually differentiate from other political forces, which are also full of patriotic slogans. They also fight. They have also grown. It's not them who are just growing. There's quite a few others. So that's probably, I don't want to say misplaced worry, but hopefully not as big as we sometimes think it really is. Thank you.
Thus, we are inching closer to the end of this session. Indeed, I would like to thank Dr. Hamish and Dr. Casper. I would like to thank Dr. Omar Ashour, the 3 splendid panelists, for their input. And we hope that we would read the 3 papers. I would like to thank those who have joined us and those who posed the questions. I would like to thank our followers in the social media, and hopefully we'll see you next time within the series of the lectures of the strategic unit. And up until then, good day to you all, and thank you very much.